Montana Territory, 1871. The sun bore down on the dusty ranch lands outside of Bitter Creek as if God himself were trying to scorch away all evidence of human folly. Nathan Vance pulled his hat lower, shielding his eyes as he rode toward the rundown Jacobson homestead. At 25, Nathan had seen enough of the frontier's brutality to believe that the West was no place for tenderness. Men came here to escape, to forget, or to die, not to build something worth keeping. The land was merciless, and so were its people. That was the truth Nathan had built his life around since watching outlaws murder his parents when he was 14. Survival meant keeping to yourself, accumulating enough to get by, and never getting attached to anything you couldn't stand to lose. Love was a luxury men like him couldn't afford, not in a place where death rode alongside you every day. Yet something pulled him toward the Jacobson place that sweltering afternoon. Rumors had circulated through town about old man Jacobson's desperation, about how drought had devastated his crops, and how the bank was coming for his land. Nathan had good pasture and breeding stock, but he worked alone by choice. No partners, no hands he couldn't dismiss when the season ended. Solitude was safety. As his horse crested the hill overlooking the Jacobson property, Nathan saw the old man standing in the yard, agitated, pacing. And on the porch sat a young woman, her honey-blonde hair catching the late afternoon sun. Even from this distance, Nathan could see the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she clutched something to her chest. Nathan had come to inquire about buying Jacobson's prized Appaloosa stallion, nothing more. Samuel Jacobson spotted him approaching and raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture that seemed halfway between a summons and a warning. Nathan dismounted cautiously, keeping one hand near his holster out of habit. The West had taught him to expect the worst in men. "You Vance." Jacobson barked, his voice graveled by years of hard drinking. "I am," Nathan replied, gaze sliding past the man to the porch where the young woman now stood. She was perhaps 20, with eyes the color of a summer storm and a simple blue dress that had seen better days. There was a fierceness in her expression that made something shift in Nathan's chest. "You come about the horse?" Jacobson asked, stepping between Nathan and his view of the girl. "Word is you've got an Appaloosa stallion worth looking at." The old man's bloodshot eyes darted to the girl, then back to Nathan. "Got something better to offer you now." A cold feeling settled in Nathan's stomach. "I came for the horse, Mr. Jacobson." $20 for the Appaloosa, that's what you said in town. Jacobson continued as if Nathan hadn't spoken. "I'll give you the horse and throw in my daughter for another 30. Behind him, the young woman made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob. "What?" Nathan's voice went dangerously quiet. "Sarah's a good worker, healthy. Bank's taking my land next week anyway. $50 total, and you get the horse and a wife." Jacobson spoke with the same detachment he might use to sell a cow. Nathan looked past him to the woman, Sarah, who now stared at him with a mixture of horror and desperate pleading. Not pleading for him to accept, he realized, but for someone, anyone, to acknowledge the grotesque indignity of her situation. "Mr. Jacobson," Nathan said carefully, aware he was walking into something far more complicated than a horse purchase. "People aren't property to be traded." The old man spat in the dirt. "Tell that to the bank that's stealing my land. Tell that to the drought that killed my crops. She's my flesh, and I'll do what I need to survive." A muscle ticked in Nathan's jaw. "Then I'll take the horse for $20 as agreed. Nothing more." "Horse alone is 30 now," Jacobson sneered. "Supply and demand, boy." Nathan should have turned around then. Should have mounted his gelding and ridden away from this mess. The smart thing, the thing that aligned with everything he believed about keeping to himself, would be to leave this family to their own troubles. Instead, he found himself staring at Sarah Jacobson, at the silent dignity in her bearing despite the humiliation her father was subjecting her to. In that moment, something old and buried stirred in Nathan's chest, a reminder of the man he might have become if the West hadn't taught him to harden his heart. $50, Nathan said finally, his voice level. "For the horse." Jacobson's face twisted with greed. "And the girl." "For the horse," Nathan repeated. "And for your daughter's freedom to choose her own path." He pulled the money from his pocket, nearly all he had from his last cattle sale. "I'll take the Appaloosa, and Miss Jacobson will have this money to start wherever she wants to go." Sarah's eyes widened, confusion replacing the dread. "She's my daughter," Jacobson protested, even as his fingers twitched toward the money. And you're selling her future either way, Nathan replied coldly. At least this way, she decides what that future is. Perhaps it was the certainty in Nathan's voice, or the way his hand had drifted back to rest on his pistol, but Jacobson snatched the money with a growl. Take them both and get off my land. Sarah hadn't moved from the porch, her knuckles white around the small bundle in her arms. Miss Jacobson, Nathan called softly, I meant what I said. The money is yours to use as you see fit. You're not obligated to me in any way. She descended the steps slowly, wariness in every line of her body. Why would you do this? The question caught Nathan off guard. In truth, he didn't know himself why he'd just spent his savings on a stranger's freedom. It contradicted everything he believed about survival on the frontier. No one deserves to be treated as property, he said finally. Even out here. Something shifted in her expression. A flicker of hope quickly guarded. I have nowhere to go. The words hung between them, a truth as stark as the Montana sky above them. Nathan thought of his small ranch, of the solitude he'd cultivated like a shield. Taking in this woman, this stranger, went against every rule he'd set for himself. I can take you to town, he offered. Or, Sarah prompted when he fell silent. I have a spare cabin on my property. It's simple, but sound. You could stay there while you figure out your next steps. The offer surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Her gaze was piercing, searching for the trap or the price. Why would you help me? Nathan couldn't explain the impulse that had driven him to intervene, that still pushed him to offer shelter. It contradicted his belief that attachments were dangerous, that helping others only invited pain. And yet, because someone should have, he said simply. Sarah Jacobson looked back at the house she'd grown up in, at the father who had tried to sell her, and then to the bundle in her arms, a small collection of clothes and what looked like a book. I accept, she said, straightening her shoulders. But I'll work for my keep. I'm no charity case. As they led the Appaloosa away from the Jacobson homestead, neither spoke. Nathan wondered what madness had possessed him to shatter his carefully constructed isolation. Sarah wondered if she'd traded one form of bondage for another. Both rode with the weight of the unknown pressing down upon them, unaware that their collision would change everything they believed about survival on the frontier. Sarah's first week at Nathan's ranch passed in wary silence. The small cabin he'd offered stood 100 yards from the main house, close enough for safety, far enough for privacy. Nathan showed her where everything was, then retreated to his solitary routine, expecting her to do the same. But on the fourth morning, he emerged to find his porch swept, firewood stacked, and Sarah in his garden, pulling weeds with methodical precision. You don't have to do this, he said, uncomfortable with the idea of her serving him. Sarah sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow. The morning sun brought out honey highlights in her blonde hair, and the growing season had already begun to put color in her cheeks. I told you I'd work, she replied simply. I keep my word. That deal was with your father, not you. Sarah's expression hardened. I've been earning my keep since I was tall enough to reach the stove. I don't know any other way to be. Nathan recognized the fierce independence in her eyes. It mirrored his own. They were both survivors, shaped by a frontier that respected nothing but strength and self-reliance. Fair enough, he conceded. But you're not a servant here. We can divide the work. Something like surprise flickered across her face. My father never. I'm not your father, Nathan interrupted, more sharply than he'd intended. An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Nathan cursed himself for his abruptness. He'd had so little practice with conversation these past years. No, Sarah said finally, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. You most certainly are not. That evening, instead of retreating to their separate dwellings as had become their habit, Sarah lingered on Nathan's porch after bringing him a portion of the stew she'd made. May I ask you something, Mr. Vance? Nathan nodded, caught off guard by her presence in this space he'd kept so deliberately empty. Why do you live out here alone? Your ranch could support hands, maybe even a family. The question probed at the walls he'd built around his past. I prefer it this way. Fewer complications. Fewer people to lose? Sarah guessed, her perception uncomfortably accurate. Nathan set his bowl down, unprepared for how easily she'd seen through him. Something like that. My mother died when I was 12, Sarah offered unexpectedly. After that, my father started drinking. The farm started failing. He became. She paused. He became someone else. I'm sorry, Nathan said, meaning it. Were you always alone? She asked, her gaze on the distant mountains turning purple in the dusk. Nathan hesitated, then found himself speaking truth he rarely acknowledged. No. My parents had a small place near Butte. Outlaws came through one night when I was 14. Took everything, killed them both. Sarah's eyes met his, filled with a recognition that needed no words. They both understood loss in a way only the frontier could teach. So you decided being alone was safer, she said softly. Isn't it? He hadn't meant it as a challenge, but it emerged as one. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Safer, maybe, but I'm starting to wonder if safer is always better. She returned to her cabin after that, leaving Nathan on his porch with thoughts he'd avoided for years stirring restlessly in his mind. By the second month, their cautious orbits had begun to intersect more frequently. Nathan found himself lingering over breakfast, appreciating Sarah's quiet company. She, in turn, seemed to seek him out with questions about the ranch, showing a keen interest in its operation. You've never branded cattle before? Nathan asked one morning when she requested to help with the small herd he kept. Father thought ranching was men's work, she replied, determination in the set of her jaw. I'd like to learn. They rode out together, and Nathan discovered Sarah was a natural horsewoman. She handled the Appaloosa, which she'd named Liberty, with an easy confidence that spoke of years spent finding freedom on horseback when her home offered none. As Nathan demonstrated how to heat the branding iron, he found himself watching her face, the way concentration brought a slight furrow to her brow. There was something about her determination that stirred his admiration. She approached each new task with the same resilience that had allowed her to survive her father's home without having her spirit broken. Like this? She asked, positioning the iron. A little more pressure, he instructed, stepping closer to guide her hands. The brief contact sent an unexpected current through him, and he stepped back quickly, confused by his reaction. Sarah successfully branded her first calf, beaming with pride. I did it. Her smile transformed her face, lighting her eyes in a way that caught Nathan unprepared. For a moment, he forgot the rules he'd set for himself, forgot that attachment meant vulnerability. You're a natural, he said, returning her smile before he could think better of it. That night, a violent thunderstorm rolled across the valley. Nathan was securing the barn when he saw Sarah running from her cabin toward the corral, where Liberty was panicking at the thunder. The stallion, she called over the wind. He's going to break through the fence. Together they fought through the driving rain to calm the frightened horse. Sarah spoke soothingly while Nathan worked to secure the gate. When lightning struck nearby, Liberty reared in terror, nearly striking Sarah with his hooves. Without thinking, Nathan pulled her against him, shielding her with his body as the horse thrashed. For a heartbeat, they stood pressed together, rain soaking them both. Nathan became acutely aware of her breath against his chest, the warmth of her despite the cold rain. Are you all right? He asked, his voice rough. She looked up at him, rain streaming down her face, and Nathan felt something inside him shift, a door opening that he'd long ago locked. Yes, she whispered. I'm all right. They managed to calm Liberty and led him to the barn. Dripping and exhausted, they stood in the lantern light, the storm continuing to rage outside. You should get back to your cabin, Nathan said, fighting the unexpected desire to keep her near. Sarah hesitated. Nathan, she said, the first time she'd used his given name, thank you. For everything. She stepped forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, then hurried out into the rain before he could respond. Nathan stood frozen, his hand rising to touch the place her lips had been, confronted with the realization that his carefully constructed solitude was crumbling, and part of him welcomed its fall. Summer bloomed across the Montana landscape, painting the hills in wildflowers and warm breezes. With each passing day, the rhythms of the ranch shifted to accommodate their growing partnership. Nathan found himself looking for Sarah each morning, the day somehow incomplete until he'd seen her smile or heard her voice. One evening in late June, they sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular oranges and pinks. Sarah had brought out her most treasured possession, a book of poetry her mother had given her. Would you like me to read some? She asked tentatively, aware that Nathan was a man of practical skills rather than literary pursuits. To her surprise, he nodded. I'd like that. As Sarah's voice filled the evening air with verses about love and longing, Nathan watched her profile in the fading light. He'd never been one for poetry, but hearing the words in her voice opened something in him, a hunger for beauty he'd long denied himself. "My mother taught me to read with this book," Sarah explained when she finished. "It was the only thing I couldn't bear to leave behind." "You read beautifully," Nathan said, meaning it. She smiled, looking down at the worn cover. "What about your parents? What do you remember most about them?" The question would have sent him retreating months ago. Now, Nathan found himself wanting to share with her. "My father taught me to track game when I was barely tall enough to hold a rifle," he said, memories surfacing that hadn't been touched in years. "And my mother, she could grow anything. Had the greenest thumb in 3 counties." He paused, throat tightening. "She sang while she worked in the garden. I still remember the songs." Sarah reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. "They sound wonderful." Nathan looked down at their joined hands, at the small calluses forming on Sarah's fingers from ranch work. "They would have liked you," he said quietly. The admission hung between them, significant in what it revealed, that Nathan had begun to imagine Sarah as part of a life he might have had, a life he might still create. The next morning, a rider appeared at the ranch, the local marshal with news that changed everything. "Samuel Jacobson's dead," he announced bluntly when Nathan met him in the yard. "Hanged himself 3 days ago." Sarah emerged from the garden, her face paling as she heard the marshal's words. "There's more," the marshal continued, pulling an envelope from his coat. "He left a confession. Seems he murdered a man in Butte 7 years ago. Man named Edward Vance." Nathan felt the ground shift beneath him. "What did you say?" "Edward Vance. According to this, Jacobson was part of a gang that robbed the Vance homestead. When the father resisted, Jacobson shot him. Says his wife was killed trying to protect him." The world narrowed to a roaring tunnel as Nathan stared at the marshal. "Edward and Mary Vance were my parents." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I'm sorry, son," the marshal said, genuine regret in his weathered face. "Thought you should hear it from me instead of town gossip." After the marshal left, a terrible silence descended. Nathan stood motionless in the yard, the revelation crashing through him like a physical blow. Sarah approached cautiously, her face ashen. "Nathan, I didn't know. Your father murdered my parents." His voice emerged flat, emotionless. "All this time." "Please," Sarah whispered, reaching for him. "I'm not him. You know I'm not." But Nathan stepped back, the walls around his heart rebuilding stone by stone. Every instinct that had warned him against attachment now screamed vindication. He'd allowed himself to care for the daughter of the man who destroyed his family. The bitter irony was too much to bear. "I think it's best if you leave," he said, unable to look at her. "Tomorrow." "Nathan, please," he cut her off, his voice breaking slightly. "I need to be alone." He walked away, back straight and shoulders rigid, retreating to the solitude that had once been his refuge. Behind him, Sarah sank to her knees in the dirt, her world crumbling for the second time. Nathan spent the night in torment, pacing his cabin as memories of his parents' murder collided with newer memories of Sarah's smile, her voice reading poetry, her hands working alongside his. By dawn, anger and grief had hardened into a cold resolve. She would leave, and he would return to the safety of isolation. It was the only way. He stepped onto his porch at first light, expecting to find Sarah preparing to depart. Instead, he found the ranch eerily quiet. Her cabin door stood open, but there was no sign of liberty in the corral. A twist of fear replaced his resolve. She wouldn't have left in the dark, would she? The mountains were dangerous at night, especially for someone traveling alone. Nathan saddled his horse with haste, a growing dread propelling him. As he prepared to search for her, he noticed a piece of paper pinned to her cabin door. Her handwriting was neat but hurried. "Nathan, I understand why you cannot bear the sight of me now. I am leaving as you asked, but I could not go without telling you that I am sorry for what my father did. The man who raised me was cruel, but I never imagined he carried such evil in him. Please know that in the time I've known you, I have come to care for you deeply. You showed me kindness when no one else would, and for that, I will always be grateful. I pray that someday you find peace. Sarah P.S. I've gone to Bitter Creek. I won't take your charity any longer." The letter trembled in Nathan's hand. Bitter Creek was nearly 20 miles away through territory known for outlaws and hostile encounters. The thought of Sarah facing those dangers alone tore through the armor of his anger. Whatever Samuel Jacobson had done, Sarah was innocent. She had suffered under the same man who had destroyed Nathan's family. The realization hit him with stunning clarity. In pushing her away, he was allowing Jacobson to claim another victim. Nathan mounted his horse and rode hard toward Bitter Creek, praying he would find her before anything happened. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as he pushed his mount to its limits, scanning the horizon for any sign of her. He was halfway to town when he spotted tracks leading off the main trail toward Rattlesnake Ridge, a shortcut, but a dangerous one. Fresh hoofprints told him Sarah had passed this way not long before. Nathan followed the tracks up into the rocky terrain, dread growing as clouds gathered overhead, threatening an afternoon storm. As he rounded a bend in the narrow trail, he saw Liberty standing riderless near a steep drop-off, reins dangling. "Sarah," he called, panic rising in his throat. A faint reply came from below the ridge. Nathan dismounted and rushed to the edge to find Sarah clinging to a narrow ledge 10 feet down. A rockslide had apparently taken out part of the trail beneath her horse, sending her over the edge. Only a scrubby pine had stopped her from falling to the canyon floor hundreds of feet below. "Hold on," he called, quickly uncoiling his rope. "Nathan," disbelief colored her voice. "How did you?" "Later," he interrupted, securing the rope. "Can you grab this?" The first drops of rain began to fall as Nathan lowered the rope. Sarah reached for it, wincing in pain. "My arm. I think it's broken." Nathan's heart pounded as he realized she couldn't climb up on her own. "I'm coming down," he decided, tying the rope around a boulder and testing its strength. He descended carefully, the rain making the rocks treacherously slick. When he reached her, Sarah's face was pale with pain and fear, but her eyes widened with confusion. "Why did you come after me?" she asked as he secured the rope around her waist. Nathan met her gaze, all his anger dissolving in the face of nearly losing her. "Because I was wrong," he said simply. "What your father did isn't your burden to bear." The rain fell harder as Nathan carefully helped Sarah climb, supporting her weight when her strength faltered. When they finally reached the top, both soaked and exhausted, Nathan pulled her against his chest in a fierce embrace. "I thought I'd lost you," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah looked up at him, rain mingling with tears on her cheeks. "I thought you wanted to." "Never," he said with sudden certainty. "Your father took my family from me once. I won't let him do it again." The admission hung between them as the rain continued to fall. Nathan cupped Sarah's face gently, seeing her truly, not as Jacobson's daughter, but as the woman who had slowly rebuilt something in him he'd thought forever destroyed. "We should get you to a doctor," he said, noticing how she cradled her injured arm. Sarah nodded, but neither moved. "Nathan," she said softly, "did you mean what you just said? About family?" Nathan felt the last of his walls crumble as he looked into her eyes. "Yes," he said. "These past months, you've become everything." He bent his head and kissed her then, gently at first, then with a passion that had been building since that night in the storm. Sarah responded with equal fervor, her uninjured arm pulling him closer. When they broke apart, breathless despite the rain soaking them both, Nathan pressed his forehead to hers. "Come home," he whispered. "Not to the cabin. Home to me." Sarah smiled through her pain, radiant even drenched and injured. "That's all I've wanted since the day you set me free." Bitter Creek, Montana Territory, 1872. Winter snow blanketed the small ranch nestled against the foothills, smoke curling invitingly from the chimney of the main house. Inside, Sarah Vance stirred a pot of stew on the stove, her wedding ring catching the light as she moved. She smiled as the door opened, bringing a rush of cold air and the man who had changed her life. Nathan stomped snow from his boots, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "Finished the new corral fence just in time," he announced, crossing to kiss her. "Storm's coming in fast." "Perfect timing," Sarah replied, leaning into his embrace. "Stew's almost ready." Their home was modest but filled with warmth, both from the crackling fire and the love that had transformed two broken souls. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes they read to each other on winter evenings. Nathan had built them himself after discovering Sarah's passion for literature. As they settled at the table, A comfortable silence fell between them, the kind that comes when two people no longer fear the quiet because they know they're not facing it alone. "I had a letter from Mary today," Sarah said, referring to the schoolteacher in town who had become a friend. "She says there's a position opening at the school come spring if I'm interested." Nathan smiled, pride evident in his expression. "You'd make a wonderful teacher." "I'd still help with the ranch," she assured him. "But I've been thinking about what you said, about building something that lasts." Nathan reached across the table to take her hand. "Whatever you want to do, I support it. This place, this life, it's ours to shape together." After dinner, they sat before the fire, Sarah nestled against Nathan's chest as he read aloud from a book of Western tales. The howling wind outside only made their shelter feel more precious. "I've been thinking," Nathan said during a pause in his reading, "about expanding the herd come spring. Maybe taking on a hand or two." Sarah looked up at him in surprise. For so long, Nathan had resisted the idea of bringing others into their world. "What changed your mind?" she asked. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch reverent. "You did. You showed me that the frontier doesn't have to harden us. That even here, especially here, we need connections to survive." He paused, his expression softening. "And if we're going to start a family someday, I'll need help with the ranch." Sarah's heart swelled at the mention of family. Something they'd spoken of as a distant possibility, now brought closer to reality. "I think that sounds perfect," she whispered, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. The young cowboy who had once believed love was a dangerous liability now looked at her with such tenderness it took her breath away. "Do you ever think about it?" Nathan asked. "How different our lives would be if I hadn't come to your father's ranch that day." Sarah considered the question, remembering the desperate young woman she'd been and the man who'd given her the most precious gift, the freedom to choose her own path. "I believe some souls are meant to find each other," she said softly. "Even in the harshest places, especially in the harshest places." Nathan kissed her then, a promise sealed without words. Outside, the Montana winter raged on, but within the home they'd built together, Sarah and Nathan Vance had discovered what the frontier tried so hard to take from those who braved its challenges. Not just survival, but a life worth living, shaped by love that had weathered the worst the West could offer and emerged stronger for it. As the fire crackled and snow piled against the windows, they held each other close. No longer two wounded survivors, but partners who had found in each other the healing the frontier had once seemed too harsh to allow.